Hello, welcome back to AWS On Air. If you're just tuning in, welcome. This is the official live streaming track here at reInvent 2020. If you've been tuning in for the earlier shows today, we had some What's Next sessions diving deep on some of the launches that we have seen throughout the weeks here at reInvent. My name's Nick. Joining me is my co-host Rob, and we are going to be talking a little bit about that exciting keynote we saw this morning in a little session we like to call Keynoteworthy. Rob, we've done quite a few of these so far. This is, if my memory serves, our fifth keynote of five, unless I'm going to in for any surprises. But lots of exciting stuff from Werner, lots of exciting stuff to talk about.
Yeah, that's right. The fifth and final keynote of our first ever digital reInvent. I hope you've been tuning into the other keynotes. This one, more than the others, kind of built off a lot of the themes that we heard from some of our other speakers throughout weeks 1 and 2. Nick, what are your general thoughts on the topics that Werner touched?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a different flavor to each of the keynotes. We see Andy's, which is the barrage of launches. We saw the machine learning keynote, which is again focused on our ML practitioners. But I think that at the end of the day, Werner's is probably the most hands-on with respect to the tangible pain points that customers feel. He spoke a lot about operating the software that we deploy. He talked a lot about solving some of the really hairy problems that don't always have like a service as a direct solution to a problem. And those are problems that we face internally at Amazon operating these managed services, and it's always nice to glean some insights into that experience. But it's even better when we can actually launch managed services that help to empower end users and developers that are using AWS. So I know a lot of the keynotes are about problems and solutions, oftentimes in the form of managed services, but I think more than anything, really just this level of realness around managed services exist, but operations, whether it's something that is in AWS's side of the shared responsibility model or on the customer side, is a challenging problem that doesn't have a discrete solution. It's sort of this ongoing battle to get better and better.
Yeah, that's a timely topic because one of the things he mentioned really early on in his keynote was that digital is the new default. And, with 2020 and all the unique challenges that we've all experienced, remote work is becoming more and more common. Now, AWS and more generally Amazon has always had a distributed development model. And, Nick, you and I have experienced this, right? We adapted to various ways of working across time zones with our colleagues. And I think that's the case for a lot of our teams across Amazon. And one of the things that I'm really glad he pointed out was, you know, this is causing a lot of interesting shifts in the usage of infrastructure, right? For example, he cited the customer case of Brainly, which is an online learning system. And what Brainly saw was just, they looked at their growth chart and it looked like a hockey stick. And when they do that, it far outstrips what their projections are. There's no way anybody could have anticipated something like COVID, and it's even harder to design a system that doesn't fall over when you're experiencing that kind of a tidal wave of traffic. And what I really like about Werner's approach to this is he's kind of saying not only do you have to kind of have the infrastructure that can help you catch the wave, but also as you do so, your system is going to develop in complexity, and that is going to cause all sorts of unpredictable behaviors, right? Because as the system gets more and more complex, it just becomes unfeasible to understand every single nuance of how every single feature interacts with every other feature. And so a lot of what he talked about was kind of like around reliability of really complex systems, telemetry, monitoring, logging. I'm really glad that he took the time to stress the importance of these kinds of fundamentals when building complex systems.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to dive much deeper in the observability and operational excellence, the class of services that enable operational excellence that he spoke about. But I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the scenery. Quite a bit different than all of the other stages that we had seen at reInvent thus far. Again, Werner being in a sugar factory outside of Amsterdam, it was an interesting, unique approach. I like the narrative style, and the launches were tied in pretty seamlessly to the stories that he was telling. But one of the particular anecdotes that he mentioned was, in addition to these changes in that we're seeing nowadays with work changes to infrastructure to meet unforeseen demand or changes both in terms of increased traffic or decreased traffic, is this broader need to reinvent, which I guess goes back to the themes touched on Andy's keynote. And the sugar factory was a great example of that, right? So it started out as a sugar factory. It experienced it regionally a diminished need for sugar and the production that the physical infrastructure had scaled up to be able to service there. So it changed entirely what the business did in terms of an output product to packaging. Again, repurposing some of that core infrastructure. And then ultimately, we see Werner there speaking in it. It's nowadays an event and a music space. And so, this is a venue or a business that's existed for over 100 years. We saw in Andy's keynote how difficult it is to build a business that can be successful for the long term. And I think the one constant in businesses that do succeed over that time span is their ability and willingness to be able to change and adapt, not just sometimes to changes in demand, but fundamentally in shifts to what the business actually does. So a cool little backdrop that sets all of the things we're talking about today in his keynote.
Yeah, it was definitely really nice change of scenery for a keynote, but also, yeah, I mean, to your point, the companies have to adapt to survive, and this year is stronger proof than we would like of that fact, right? Um, and I think it's also, he also kind of took the time to kind of connect the fact that a lot of the most important work that's done, we as an infrastructure company enable that work, but really it's our customers that go out and do that work. He kind of alluded to the customer case of Leah Von Bitter from Ava. This is a healthcare startup that provides it seeks to be a long-term companion for women by providing data-driven insights for their reproductive lives. And I had the pleasure of meeting Leah in Portugal during Web Summit, and she was incredible. She has this very precise vision of what's missing. And right after talking to her, I was just floored. I had to learn more about the her business. I really wanted to see her succeed, and it was really cool seeing her on stage with Werner today, sharing her story and specifically how she used AWS to enable that precise vision that she had.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of to dovetail that story from Ava with the sugar factory example there, one of the precursors um to Ava being able to solve that problem for their customers is the ability to collect that data, that biometric data, right? And so at first glance, you could look at a company like this and say, oh, hey, they're a physical device company. They distribute this physical sensor that you wear on your wrist, and then it collects the biometric data. And they do some work on that. But fundamentally, in their own words, Ava says, we're more of a data company, or they're more of a data company, right? Because while that may be the first problem collecting of that data, the real value they deliver to their customers and their users is the ability to be able to glean insights and make life decisions around those insights. So really exciting to see that. And regardless of what vertical or what industry you're in, I think this trend that we've seen is that every company is not only a software company but also a data company, because you're collecting this data. Hopefully, Werner's been telling you to collect it since, what was it, 2012, right? And logs, and we'll get into that in a second. But the real value is sort of the downstream analysis on that data that you can deliver for your customers, which is going to be different for every single company.
Yeah, and in particular, what Ava is I found it really interesting when she was talking about the COVID Red project and the role that her company is playing in it, because what this project is trying to do is to use healthcare data over time to make to make predictions about one's vulnerability to COVID, and perhaps even making some sort of prediction about whether this person has COVID even without a test. I find that fascinating, right? I mean, we know that there are a lot of companies working on this problem, working on all sorts of different dimensions. We've heard earlier from the different keynotes, um, but it's just fascinating to me how many of these companies that are tackling this pandemic rely on AWS to deliver key infrastructure solutions, whether it's data storage, analysis, machine learning, IoT. There's just so many parts of this industry that come back to AWS, and it's pretty inspiring to see and to work at a company that is able to affect the lives of so many people for good.
Precisely. And we love being able to see customer stories like this where they're forces of good in the world, able to develop products, services that many of us use ourselves, right? But here at AWS, we like to handle the undifferentiated lifting on the infrastructure side to enable these stories, right? We saw a large number of those launches across all the other keynotes, and Werner's was certainly no exception. So we saw problems for, typically I'd say developers, but it's clearly much more than that. But a lot of the launches that we saw here in Werner's keynote definitely more on oriented towards the ops side of development work and operating of software. So there are quite a few launches. Where do we want to start here?
Yeah, well, I think we should probably start with the announcement of the Cloud Shell, the AWS Cloud Shell, which is now generally available. And you can think of this as a companion to Cloud9. Now, I know a lot of people out there have used Cloud9. If you haven't, don't worry. It's our online IDE. It comes with a whole bunch of tools, integrated workflows, workspace sharing right out of the box. And it's increasingly being used as a tool for teaching computer science because it just cuts through all of that setup. What kind of dev environment do you have? Do you have all the dependencies installed? It cuts through all of that and gets right to coding. So Cloud9, a very interesting product, Cloud IDE, Cloud Native IDE. But now we know that a lot of developers, they want they just want a terminal. And the thing is that terminal, while it has, it's long been touted that the terminal superpower is its portability. You connect to a terminal anywhere, and it's your environment, and you know how to use a handful of tools. I'm going to break from that crowd. Personally, that's not been my experience, right? I've customized Vim, for example, to the point where I kind of need my Vim RC file in order to be maximally effective. And I suspect that that's that's the case with a lot of people now. And forgetting Vim, forgetting your editor and your basic tools, there are also just tools and API keys and permissions and things that you find yourself setting up over and over and over again. And this is just not necessary. And I'm glad to see that Werner kind of announced here the AWS Cloud Shell in its GA form, and it does all the things that I would want something like this to do. It comes prepackaged with all sorts of tools like the AWS CLI, the ECR CLI. It comes with Node, Bash, Python, Git, all the tools that you need. And the thing that he emphasized was, this is not just an AWS dev environment. This is a general purpose dev environment that happens to work really well with AWS. So I can't wait to get my hands on that. And I think a lot of customers are going to enjoy it too.
Yeah, and again, Rob, your point on portability, I haven't been able to deeply read through the pricing structure yet, but again, folks that are used to working with Cloud9, there's some underlying infrastructure that you manage, you choose the size of the box, and so on and so forth. And to my understanding, what Cloud Shell helps to bring is to sort of scrape away all of that. Again, you just want an ability to run CLI commands and the ability to interact with AWS services, much like the way that you can in the console already. Again, behind the browser, you're just interacting with all the APIs. And so with Cloud Shell, again, hold me to this if I'm wrong, but it's sort of a cost, a no cost way of being able to interact with these APIs programmatically and not need to completely separate onto your own local dev environment or a Cloud9 IDE. One of the most exciting parts of this launch that I saw was actually the incorporation of 1 GB storage for free. So again, the Cloud Shell will have ephemeral storage that every time you spin up a new terminal will be removed, but 1 GB of persistent storage should be more than enough. When handling files and objects properly. Again, if you need persistent storage on large files, push those over to S3. But some amount of like a local file system that you can persist across sessions is really great to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also brings security benefits, right? When you consider what the classical dev setup is when you're working with AWS, everybody's gone through this, right? You basically download your API key, you set permissions on the API key, and then you configure AWS with the various profiles, you put in the .credentials file. I mean, think about that though. If you have several different dev machines, you're setting that up once per dev machine. That's n number of places where you're storing the keys to the kingdom. Usually dev credentials have near superpowers in your infrastructure. And so the ability to have a cloud shell that you can then secure with IAM privileges or your standard IAM policies, just for accessing altogether, is already a godsend in terms of security posture.
Exactly. So again, making it easier to interact with services you may already know and love, or Rob, I know you and I spin up demos all the time. Again, switching devices, maybe we're on the road. This seems like a much easier way. Right where my services live inside of my AWS account, gated by whatever my IAM role is. I can now have a cloud shell that has all of those same permissions and just sort of keep it all in one place. So quicker time to value or time to delivering on certain projects. So very exciting there.
Yeah. Now, changing tracks real quick, I want to talk about the climate change, the theme of climate change. We saw this come up in a couple of the other keynotes, and you know, Werner's message is no different here, and I think it's worth repeating because it's just such a big deal, right? Climate change now is more important than ever before, and he cites this statistic that if you run your applications in the cloud, you can reduce your carbon footprint by 88% as compared to running your applications on premise. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that cloud data centers operate more efficiently. We talked about this a lot before, right, Nick? The scale of investment and innovation that AWS is able to make. And we don't. I want to break that down a little bit. That doesn't mean that only we can afford it. It means that it only makes sense for us at this scale, right? There are a lot of companies that can look at this problem and say, okay, well, if we do the math, we look at the way that the numbers roll out, the horizon on a return on investment for building a more efficient data center is hundreds of years out. We're not going to do that. That makes total sense for them. And the way to incentivize them to reduce their carbon footprint is to look at those numbers, right? It's almost like, when we talk about building a new product, you get down to unit economics. This is just the proven way to get companies to do this. We can talk all we want about, how important it is, but until you kind of talk about the bottom line and the incentives for these companies, you really don't have a holistic way to make sure everybody's moving in the same direction. So, and what better way to do it than this, right? I mean, we were talking about all the benefits of the cloud, but then you have this killer statistic, 88% more efficient. Nick, what do you think about that?
Yeah, we saw in Peter DeSantis's keynote again, the global infrastructure keynote, a lot of really under the hood insights that go into making managed services possible and what Amazon and AWS do in the creation and operation of these data centers. And he had three salient points for how any company, but especially AWS, can effectively reduce their carbon output and carbon emissions. The first of which is don't emit that carbon to begin with. And this actually is the extension of your point. If fundamentally we are able to at AWS right size our infrastructure such that we're not operating latent hardware that isn't actually processing workloads, that's where a lot of the bulk of that 88% improvement comes from. Second, we have the ability to be more efficient in the processes that will continue to emit carbon. And then we can look to renewable energy sources to then power those processes. Let's dive a little bit deeper on that one, because that's actually where the story of ARM and the Graviton 2 chip really become very powerful. Graviton 2, obviously, we've heard about it a lot. It's custom silicon that powers our compute optimized instances with an ARM-based architecture. But one of the other sort of nice side effects of the Graviton 2 chip, it is actually the most efficient most efficient chip with respect to power and consequently emissions of any chip that AWS has ever run in its data center. So we see not only an avoidance of emissions in sort of point one, but then in point two, what we're seeing is of the workloads that we are operating, sort of improving that unit economics, reducing the amount of emissions for those workloads that are running sort of continuously across any of the customers' workloads. And then third, which again, sort of out of band for this conversation here, but the construction of data centers themselves. It was fascinating to get to see some of the work that's going into deeply understanding how concrete is produced to create our data centers all around the world, and these sort of less obvious but peripheral emission sources, and how we at AWS can work to reduce those on the path to net zero emissions.
Yeah, exactly. I really like the fact that Werner called out that reducing our carbon emissions is a shared responsibility between AWS and our customers. We've talked a lot about what AWS and more broadly Amazon is doing with our participation in the climate pledge, our goal to reach zero carbon emissions by 2040, our investment in the climate pledge fund, which funds a lot of startups that do a lot of this uh, incredible work around reducing carbon emissions. For example, when you build concrete. But really, there's more, and I'm glad that Werner highlighted the fact that customers are asking. We're not telling them, right? They're asking us, what can they do to make their infrastructure more efficient, to do their part in solving this climate challenge. And there is something very concrete customers can do, and that is to invest in a migration to an ARM-based architecture. Why? Because Nick, as you just pointed out, the Graviton 2 chip, when you move your workloads there, not only do you get 40% better performance per dollar, you also get 2 to 3.5 times more power efficiency. We've seen a lot of innovation in this space, but compute is at the bottom of all of it, right? And to have this kind of leap forward in both price, performance, and efficiency is just mind-boggling. So, I totally agree with Werner. Investing in migrating your application architecture from x86 to ARM unlocks all of these benefits, and it can become a strategic advantage for your business. So that's something that you can do immediately, and it's also not as difficult as you might have thought. I know that the ARM support for various platforms, languages, services has started in fits many years ago, but now it's better than ever, right? A lot of your workloads, whether it's Django, whether it's Ruby, whether it's Node, whether it's your containers, Docker, all these workloads have been running on ARM for a long time. They're battle tested, they're ready to go. And in a lot of these cases, you don't really need to make many changes. In the case of Docker, for example, I think it's making a one-line change in your Docker file for most images. So it's definitely worth a shot. And if you're not there yet, talk to your exec, email your exec, and just say, hey, I heard that by making one small surgical change, we can reduce our operating costs by 40%. Are you interested? And I guarantee you, you're gonna get a response to that.
Yeah, the words dependable and battle tested, never more relevant than what I'm about to talk about here. And it's that, we at AWS in the shared responsibility model, to an SLA and to a certain degree of nines of reliability, promise customers a dependable and resilient systems. But at the end of the day, customers still build their own custom applications on top of that fundamental infrastructure. And I think, let's not pretend here, dependable and resilient systems don't happen by accident. You could have uptime where simply your threat vectors haven't sort of come to roost quite yet. But actually building in and baking in dependability and resiliency requires a lot of legwork. And Peter DeSantis talked a lot about this. But again, in this keynote, Werner spoke about how we can deliver this and make that better for customers. So, for example, use of formal logic, the ability to be able to develop systems that work with the underlying first principles of why a system will behave a certain way, to perform checks against that before you launch or configure any of your applications, separate from the ability to test sort of downstream and trying to assess how the system behaves, right? This sounds very semantic or pedantic in the difference, but fundamentally the difference can be, the launching or the unsuccessful launching of a rocket, and customers like NASA are using some of these techniques through formal verification for software to operate spacecraft for this exact reason, right? But one tangible example of how customers are sort of building atop some of these systems is S3, right? S3 prior to this had read after write eventual consistency. There's, again, for a lot of customers, this may have not had significant implications, but for those that did face this, they oftentimes built in additional complexity and feature sets atop this eventually consistent system to achieve strong consistency. And we saw this and saw, well, this doesn't really seem quite right? Why are customers building the same feature over and over and over again that they wish could exist within the product? And that's why we were super excited to announce strong read after write consistency, again, with no API changes or additional costs. anytime there's more value for no additional changes, that's something that I want to see. Um, on top of this, I know we
Yeah.
only have like 5 minutes left in this recap, but let's make sure that we get to some of the large announcements here. I was super excited to see AWS Fault Injection Simulator. We've been hearing so much about chaos engineering. Rob, is there anything here in this launch that jumped out to you?
Yeah, I mean, this is great. I mean, this is almost kind of like uh, a continuation, a next step in the area of chaos engineering. One of the things that's always been really difficult to do in this area when you're injecting fault and testing the resiliency of your system is to be able to inject faults into the control plane. What happens when some of the underlying infrastructure APIs themselves are unresponsive, right? And I'm really glad that that was called out as one of the highlight features of Fault Injection Simulator. Another one that you would expect to be there is also always really useful is just toggling latency, right? You'd be surprised how many things break when you just make the server 10 times slower. And this is a great way to kind of uh, get ahead of a lot of potential outages and pitfalls. A lot of companies now they run these things called game days, and these are kind of company-wide simulations of events. The idea is to kind of do it in a controlled environment before nature does it to you. And then what they'll do is they'll do controlled takedowns of certain data centers, certain AZs, certain services, just to understand better how their services can react. And in a lot of these cases, that will also be combined with spiky traffic to understand the scaling benefits of the service. And I'm really glad that this pattern or this practice, whatever you want to call it, has become so commonplace that we can now offer a service that does most of the heavy lifting for it.
Exactly. And on top of being able to actually inject that failure and to mess around with your system such that you can observe the output, separate from any sort of chaos engineering, you deeply want to have observability and understanding of how your application is performing. Werner talked to the difficulty of dealing with high cardinality data where you have essentially many dimensions to it and many parts in the process or of your application from ingestion to serving the request and returning it. And so there were a few really interesting things here, but with contributor insights, the goal here is to make it easy to take a graph and pair significant factors, surface correlated factors, and metrics. So, for example, you have the time in which a request hits your load balancer, the impacted latency on the user's end or the client side, and then you also have the status of the host all at one time. These are relevant to diagnosing and understanding the full picture of an experience. And you can see this sort of this continuity is difficult because you need some sort of uh, primary attribute that is consistent across that entire stack. You see that in S3 with requests with the XAMZ request ID, but being able to have CloudWatch synthetics to be able to more easily tie this end to end and have canaries to be able to see and observe how your system is behaving before it hits customer requests is immensely valuable.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of observability, one of the other side of gathering this data is viewing it, collecting it, querying it, turning it into graphs, setting monitors. And in this space, what we see are two very popular services, Grafana and Prometheus. These are relatively new services that have really kind of exploded in popularity over the last few years. And we know a lot of customers depend on them for monitoring their critical infrastructure metrics. And so we're really happy to announce two new services: Amazon Managed Service for Grafana and Amazon Managed Service for Prometheus. And as the name entails, these are entirely managed services. So we take away all of the dirty work of having to deploy, patch, maintain, scale, secure all of these things and the underlying infrastructure for you. And this is going to save you a lot of time. It's going to get just deliver the pure value of using these services and using them to monitor your infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't gotten to get my hands on either of these yet, but these are services that typically just go hand in hand, right? You use Prometheus for your logging and installing the agent on some of your infrastructure, and then using Grafana to sort of collect all of those metrics and visualize it, create your own custom dashboards. Whether you're already deep in CloudWatch or you're just used to using Grafana, I think this again just gives customers more choice to be able to have observability in the way that they desire.
Yeah, and then one last call out here is, of course, that this plays very nicely with our time series database time stream. When you store time stream data in there, you can, of course, deploy your own instance of Grafana to visualize that data, but now you can also have the managed option at your disposal.
And it also plays very nicely with one of the last few announcements Werner had here, which is the general availability launch of AWS Distro for OpenTelemetry. Rob, you and I actually got to sit down with the service team earlier this year to see that while it was in preview. Again, AWS Distro for OpenTelemetry, an open source project and an expansion of some of the functionality for the OpenTelemetry project. Upstream first contributions, some very natural tie-ins here with both the managed service for Grafana and Prometheus.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're approaching logging from more of a build your own approach, it's likely that you're already working with OpenTelemetry, and it works with that just fine, as you said.
Wonderful. Well, there's certainly so much to talk about, but such limited time. And that is for good reason. It's because we have a full 8 hours of content today on the AWS On Air channel. Rob and I will be back again later in the day to talk a little bit more about everything from the what's next sessions that are coming up immediately following this to some of the industry recaps and some of the keynote topics that we didn't get to spend a lot of time on today. So, stick around. Rob and I will be back later. We have a full schedule that we'll post in the Twitch chat if you're watching there. But otherwise, immediately after this, we're going to have an industry recap session for games. So you're here on Twitch. You probably are a player of games just like myself. Stick around. I'm going to be joined by very special guests to talk a little bit about everything reInvent, all the new launches, and what has been happening in the games industry here in 2020. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us for the Werner Keynote recap. We'll be back in just a minute. Take it easy.